I'll open it up in sort of a strange way. Every morning I go to get my coffee. I open my refrigerator and I see my top shelf packed with milk. I love milk. And I think about the FDA because they're what keep milk and all of our other foodstuffs safe. You may not realize it, that's how they started. People used to dilute milk and then add plaster of Paris to get it white. We are so fortunate as a country to have an institution that is nearly 125 years old, that keeps our drugs effective and safe, and keeps our food safe. They also have a fascinating history and a very informative history addressing issues around rare disease. So I like to say that the FDA is like Gaul, if you studied Latin, divided into three parts. There is something called CBER, which stands for the biologics, the gene therapy division. There's something called CDER, which is the drug division. And they cover drugs like enzyme replacement therapies. There's something that does radiological health and devices. We don't care about them that much. But CDER and CBER are key to our future, and they are doing great things for us. And I'm excited to introduce Dr. Rachel Anatol, who is joining us. She is, I'll say, sort of third in command at CBER. She is the assistant to the super director of the Office of Therapeutics, Dr. Nicole Verdun, who is an amazing new appointment in CBER. She has a history of medical genetics training and also working in gene therapy labs. So she gets us, so to speak. And she also works in the same division that Peter Marks does, who spoke here last year. And one of the things Peter Marks said to us was, I think you're going to be excited about the developments in the year to come. And boy, have we been excited. So I also wanted to take some time to introduce my longtime collaborator, Patty Dickson, from Washington University. Patty is a holder of a centennial chair in genetics and genomics in the pediatrics department. She is well known to many of you here. She has been involved in a lot of important clinical trials and has a very firsthand knowledge of the difficulties that many trialers and programs face trying to get trials on board, enrolled, conducted, etc. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the difficulties from a regulatory perspective about getting therapies into market. And I want to just highlight some of the background and history of the FDA, besides just the fact that they make safe milk, right? Which is important, but goes beyond other things. So recognizing that rare disease and orphan drugs were a special class, in the early 80s, in 1983, there was the Orphan Drug Act passed. In the early 2000s, in 2002, there was an act that defined what a rare disease was, that was going to help regulatory frameworks to incentivize development of drugs in rare disease. Between those two dates, our advocacy allies out there in medicine and science, the HIV/AIDS community, lobbied the FDA in some ways that were not quite entirely polite and deferential. And the ACT UP programs, et cetera, they were able to help develop the accelerated approval pathway that the FDA developed to get drugs into clinic faster than traditional efforts, so that when there was exceptional need, they would not bend the rules, but look at science and medicine more creatively to get us to a drug approval faster. Things have continued to move even more beneficially in our direction. In 2023, there was a standing committee called the Genetics and Metabolic Disease Advisory Committee, the GEMDAC. This is now a standing committee to help represent our kinds of diseases as an advisory committee to the FDA. And their first convening was a very positive result for the Niemann-Pick community that led to an approval. So they're developing formats where our researchers and our clinicians can speak clearly to the FDA about the efficacy of products and about the special issues of our diseases. This summer, I was thrilled to note that the combined heads of CEDAR and CBER, Peter Marks and Patricia Cavazzone, announced a rare disease innovation hub. This is an organization that spans both divisions approving drug products, that is really looking at how can we think innovatively about developing regulatory frameworks to improve product development and address the needs of the rare disease patient community. So without further ado, I would like to hand this over to Rachel to talk about some of the other innovative efforts that the FDA is making to help address the real needs that our community have in the MPS and broader rare disease communities.
Great, thank you so much for the introduction. Thanks to the Society for having me here today. We're thrilled to be here. So as you said, I am Rachel Anatol. I am a PhD by training in molecular and cell biology, and I've been in the gene therapy field since 2007. So a lot of time in the field. I am Dr. Nicole Verdun's deputy, which really means she's the president and I'm the vice president, and we talk to each other no less than probably 50 times a day, and that is not an exaggeration. When my phone rings past 7 p.m., my kids go, "It's Nicole." So we talk a lot, but I heard a lot today that I would like to be able to address. You know, I want to start by saying there are a lot of exciting things happening at FDA. I really do think we are moving in the right direction for rare disease, and I'll talk about some of the new things we're working on, while also understanding there's been profound disappointment with FDA, and that is something that we're aware of, and that is something that we really take to heart. But I do want to stress that you have our complete commitment to developing therapies for MPS, all forms of MPS, and all other rare diseases as well. It's from the top down, full commitment. Dr. Verdun and I go to every single meeting in our office. So whenever we meet with a sponsor, we have a pre-meeting. We had over 600 sponsor meetings last year. So that's 1,200 meetings Nicole and I went to just those types of meetings. So we are fully committed. There's a couple programs I'd really like to talk about. There's the Rare Disease Innovation Consortium, which Dr. Ellinwood just referred to. So Dr. Marks and Dr. Cavazzone are the heads of this innovation consortium, and it's really a one-stop shop for patients and patient groups and advocacy groups to be able to reach out to FDA and know that they will have audience across the entire FDA, right? FDA is big, and to me, I know all its parts, but if someone were to say, how can I contact someone at another federal government agency like CMS or CDC, I wouldn't know how to direct them. So I can only imagine that that's how FDA is for folks on the outside of the agency. So now you can just come directly to the consortium, and your inquiry, your questions will be directed without, you having to do the legwork. So that's one aspect of that consortium. Another is that it gathers folks across the agency to talk about some of the really challenging issues in rare disease drug development. So appropriate biomarkers, appropriate clinical trial design, what to do when there's only a small number of patients enrolled in a trial. What do we do when we think something works, but it's hard to say there's substantial evidence of effectiveness, but we want to help it get to market? These are some of the questions that this consortium is going to be dealing with in the hopes to provide consistency across the agency, understanding that there will be some differences because gene therapies and enzyme replacement therapies are different types of products with different considerations. Sorry, I'm racing and getting short of breath all at the same time. Another program we have is the START pilot. So I am not going to try and remember what that stands for, but it is basically speeding development of rare disease treatments. So it is when we work with sponsors as closely as possible. The sponsor in this program, it's a pilot program, says we need to meet tomorrow, we meet tomorrow. And that is very different than I think our normal meetings. We try and meet with sponsors as soon as we can, but as you can imagine, if we've got 700 meetings, it's hard to get things on the books. But this is a great program. We have gotten a lot of positive feedback from the sponsors who are participating in that program. It's a CBER and CEDAR program. And I'm sure everyone is aware that CEDAR does have a sponsor working on MPS development, drug development under the STAR program. There's also the ARC program in CEDAR, which is to advance development of products for rare diseases. There is a similar program in CBER. So there are just rare disease meetings that we meet about in CBER all the time. We also meet with CEDAR now under this Rare Disease Innovation Consortium. And I really think things are changing. You know, in the gene therapy, cell therapy world, the advice you may have gotten from the agency 5-6 years ago is probably a little bit different or a lot different than the advice you would get now. And we're working very closely with our sponsors. We are very open-minded to innovative trial designs. We've had a number of recent product approvals for pediatric rare diseases that did not require a placebo-controlled trial, that used biomarkers, accelerated approval, really trying to take all of our tools and use them to move products forward. So as I said, there's a lot of exciting work. There's still challenges, and there will continue to be disappointments. And those are disappointments that are felt on the outside and that are also felt on the inside of the agency. We're all here and committed to moving these products forward. And so if I can leave everyone with anything today, it is that commitment. And I will just share that I have 2 children. One child underwent a major trauma, the kind of trauma that I think probably everyone in this room knows, where you're negotiating with the universe. If you just change this for my child, I will do anything. And that doesn't work. So as we all know, so you have that commitment, and that's what I hope I can send folks home with after this meeting.
Thank you, Rachel. Before I hand it over to Patty, I wanted to just put out there that the FDA sponsors an extraordinary virtual and this year in-person event on Rare Disease Day, a Rare Disease Week. And this year they will be partnering with the NIH for a 2-day program. That will be February 27th and 28th. You are all able to join that virtually. And I encourage you to take the time, as you are able, to tune in and find out all the wonderful things that the FDA is doing to try and advance progress in rare disease. I'd like to hand it over to Patty now. She has a very well-informed perspective on the challenges that we all face trying to get clinical trials approved, enrolled, productive, to endpoints, and then leading to some kind of clinical improvement. Patty, take it away, please.
Well, thank you, Matthew. No pressure. It was actually 20 years ago that I was at my first MPS Society meeting, which was in Orlando at the Contemporary Resort. I have been working, at that time, we were working on the first intrathecal enzyme replacement therapy studies for MPS type 1, trying to get clinical trials there. And I think, you know, when I was starting out in that time, we saw these incredible preclinical results, really encouraging, and we got together the brightest minds we could find in the field to design a clinical trial, design endpoints. And, you know, we weren't ultimately successful in demonstrating effectiveness of that therapy within those, you know, within what was available to us. And it led to a workshop that I actually put on with Ann Pariser from FDA, Steve Groff from the Office of Rare Diseases at NIH and NINDS on research challenges in CNS therapies for inborn errors in metabolism back in 2009, where we, you know, looked at things like natural history and data and trial design. And ultimately, I guess, you know, after working very hard, you know, so many people working so hard, and I agree there's a lot of hope going forward, but we all wonder whether the current regulatory framework is adequate for very, very rare diseases. Do you have the tools you need? Or is some more innovation needed?
You're posing that. It's a great question. I really do think that we have the tools we need. I think part of it is a change of mindset that has happened at the agency. I think we had the same tools in 2009, but I don't think the mindset is where it is now. And I think that's going to make a big difference. We are open to anything that a sponsor comes to propose for us. Dr. Verdun and I know Peter, although he and I haven't had this exact conversation, but we are starting from a place of yes. We are going to let this trial go forward unless it is not safe. Whether, that's not safe because we've seen, real safety concerns in animal models, whether it's not safe because we're not sure that the manufacturing is going to lead to production of a safe product. Those are going to be questions that come up. But I think historically, there might have been a place of starting from, you have to show us we can say yes. And that's very different than us starting from a place of yes. And then I think, I really can't say this enough, but I think the mindset shift has been profound, really. And we know that something is better than nothing. And we know that if we say no to an IND, which is an investigational new drug application, and we put it on hold, we know the effect that has across the field. We know what the investment situation is like. I think we do have the tools. But there are real challenges. I think in gene therapy, one issue we have in gene therapy is right now it's a one-time treatment. So it can be very challenging if we have some proof of concept, but it's not very strong. And we're asking ourselves, if we allow this to go forward in a clinical trial and it doesn't have any benefit, will these children be able to enroll in another trial in the future? Those are tough questions, but we are really facing them with openness.
Now, I have not yet had the opportunity to work with CBER. All of my experience has been with CDER, which covers protein therapeutics and, to me, inexplicably ASOs. But that's another problem for a question for another day. But so is there an effort to harmonize the approach, and are you able to speak at all to that?
Yeah, I think that's one of the areas that the agency has identified as a focus that the agency has to have. And that's part of, I think, what's going to happen under this Rare Disease Innovation Hub. I think I called it a consortium. It's a hub, not a consortium. But working to harmonize, I would say harmonization really needs to happen towards the more open perspective, right? We don't want to harmonize, to a more conservative approach. So that is an area, I think that Patricia and Peter, I think at that meeting we had maybe about a month ago when the hub kicked off, I think they communicated that was a big area they wanted to focus on. And those are fair questions. So come to us with those questions. You can ask us anything when you come to a meeting, and that's a very fair question.
No, and having, this is really great. I would say we've had lots of interactions with FDA, and people have been very thoughtful.
Yeah.
They're caring people. A lot of them see patients. They have, the MDs, and they still have clinic and see patients. I will say, for the most part, when speakers have come, they've come with a disclaimer. I can't speak for the agency, and this is a very open conversation that you're having with us, which is very appreciated.
Okay.
So, yeah, I guess, what other threats do you see to rare disease therapeutics that maybe, we all in this room could help with?
Well, I think that's a loaded question. That may be the hardest question of the day for me. I think there's a lot there. The biggest threats in rare disease, I think there's one, which is going to sound simple, but it's not coming and talking to us. So let me give you an example of that. We recently met with a company who said, we've talked to some people in the field and they told us we could never do this. So we're not going to ask you if we can do this. And we said, you don't hear from FDA, someone can never do this. And I think they were surprised that we'd be open to allowing them to do what they had been told they couldn't do. So I think not coming and talking to us is a potential downfall. I think that there's a lot of politics right now, and I think that's going to be a challenge. I think, Matthew and I were talking a little bit about, the funding bill and that it includes, the priority review voucher and some questions there. I think those are concerns that, in terms of cost of making these products. You heard it on the prior panel. I mean, I think that is a huge challenge. And I think sometimes FDA decisions lead to challenges. We have certainly seen that if we have put a trial on hold, it doesn't really want to make other companies or investors move into that area. And that's a problem as well.
I was wondering if you could speak to a recent development outside of the FDA. So many of you may know that a foundation that had been legislatively created in the late 2000s called the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA exists outside the FDA. And it's a forum where they can discuss important topics that the FDA really is not equipped to tackle. And of course, that's the forum where myself and Patty and Joe Munzer and many others contributed to the heparan sulfate workshop, defining it as a biomarker for accelerated approval. And even though that was not an official FDA function, and even though it was not an officially certified biomarker, we saw 4 programs, 2 in CEDAR and 2 in CBER, who were given the permission to use accelerated approval to move forward. Now, I think since that program, because everybody was so excited about it, there's been some discussion about a science-driven drug development program, akin to the patient-focused drug development programs. So this would be science-focused. It would allow scientists from many different stakeholders, many different researchers, to come together to arrive at a consensus to help the FDA in a program that was not, it was agnostic as to an individual program that was being developed. Is there discussion within the agency about some kind of system like that? Or do you view that as sort of a role for the GEMDAC or for the hub?
I think I view it as a role for the hub, but I also view it as a, effort that folks outside of the agency can continue to push, right? I think that the meeting you're referring to was pretty groundbreaking in the type of meeting that it was. I've been at FDA since 2007 with a 1-year stint in industry and came back to FDA. And I haven't been to a meeting like that before. And I think that it was very important. I think that the patient-focused drug development meetings and the impact of the patient voice in the advocacy organizations has also been tremendous. There have been a number of discussions where, we're talking about a specific product. So of course, I'm not going to provide any information on that, but where we have said, okay, yes, we're kind of uncomfortable. We don't, because no one who's a reviewer wants to allow something to go forward and have something bad happen. So there can be some discomfort in some of the things we see and we're being asked to opine on. But we have heard loud and clear from patients and advocacy groups that patients, especially with rare diseases where there are no alternative therapies or there are therapies, but they're Band-Aids, that there is a willingness to take a risk that might not otherwise be accepted. And that is impactful and it has impacted our decisions. And I think that the Reagan-Udall Foundation meeting earlier this year has certainly impacted decision-making within the agency. And so I think I think continued meetings like that would be very beneficial.
So one of the, the questions then is, so let's say we get across that line,
Mhm.
across that accelerated approval line, and then you have to demonstrate clinical benefit. Is there, or maybe this is a question for you more, Matthew, have you seen any change in payer willingness to cover drugs approved under the accelerated approval pathway? I know that they've always had the ability to call those not medically necessary or some way avoid paying for them. Is there any worsening of that?
I do not know that there's any worsening of it, but that's because I follow our disease programs in our space. And except for, I think it's Fabrazyme, which was given an accelerated approval back in the 2000s, it took 13 or 18 years for their program to convert to from conditional approval to full approval. I don't think that there were payer issues there during that period. I haven't heard of it. I think that more of a concern is just some of these big ticket gene therapies, the sort of one and dones, the kinds of things we're seeing being approved and provided now for MLD. There are state Medicaid programs that are resistant to those, and those often are state by state battles that we need to fight. And that is just an issue for advocacy to prevent that from happening at the legal step, legislative step, and also to keep pushing for access across state borders for Medicaid patients and all of these issues. I haven't seen it yet. I hope that we don't. I know that at least listening to individuals at FDA, they are very clear. An accelerated approval is still, in some respects, an approval. It may not be full approval, it may be conditional, but it is an approval. That is an approved drug. And from their perspective, it should be managed accordingly.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that it is, an accelerated approval is an approval. You still have to demonstrate to FDA substantial evidence of effectiveness to be granted accelerated approval. What it is that it allows an approval at an earlier time point than we might otherwise be able to see. And so, I went actually this spring and I spoke at a payer conference to try and help provide some education on what accelerated approval really is. It is not a get out of jail free card. It is not your program failed, so now you get accelerated approval. It is, maybe we wouldn't be able to see clinical benefit, in some disease until children were maybe, 12 to 14 years of age, or, at some time point where the development differentiates, if you have a disease versus if you don't. And that can be too late. That can just simply be too late to treat patients. And that is actually another question for gene therapy. How early can we treat? We think probably the earlier, the better in many cases. But we've really tried to stress, but it is a question. I mean, a lot of payers came up to me after that meeting and said, how do I know which one is going to be converted to traditional approval after it receives accelerated approval? And I don't have an answer to that question, but I think it's probably an area where education and advocacy could help.
I know that there is an effort among some of us, advocates and stakeholders, to think about an ultra rare disease act, and that defining it may improve the lot in terms of regulatory approvals and in terms of stakeholder development of programs if we defined legislatively an ultra rare disease. And one of the things that's part of that approach is to put into legislation a requirement for FDA to consider the totality of the evidence. So not necessarily one individual outcome, but to look at multiple outcomes where maybe there's marginal improvements in each one, but when you look at all of them, and they're all positive, even though if slightly, that's something that can be weighted in the drug approvals favor. And that becomes an issue for many of our diseases where you have extremely small populations. There is heterogeneity in terms of the individual's presentation and how they progress and how they respond. Is there any discussion within FDA about using something like the totality of the evidence currently?
We already use the totality of the evidence.
There we go.
You know, when we approve a product, either traditional, we call it traditional approval or accelerated approval, we issue a document called the Summary Basis for Regulatory Approval, the SBRA. And that document summarizes what we took into account to determine substantial evidence of effectiveness for the approval. And, you know, to prepare for this meeting, I was reading through some of the SBRAs from our own office just to refresh myself. And there was one that stood out to me. We approved based on a single-arm study because for rare diseases, especially, we can approve based on one single-arm study with confirmatory evidence. And I think the confirmatory evidence is the totality picture. And we obtained confirmatory evidence from some patients that were treated in Europe, so not even treated in the US. We looked at some natural history data. We looked at some other types of data. So I think that was a great example of where we said, okay, here we've got something, and let's pull what we need to pull to be able to have substantial evidence effectiveness to meet the regulatory threshold.
Excellent. I am mindful that we have really been talking up here to try and give all of you a sense of both the process and the elements that are involved in drug approval and in clinical trial recruitment and procedures. Do we have any questions in the audience? Raise your hand high and someone will come with a microphone. Bethany is circulating a microphone. We have a question over here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all your information. I was just curious how you might see the new administration and how the funding might be affected as a result of the new administration, and certainly a squashing of the funding bill, and what your thoughts are. I know I don't want to get political, but I'm just curious.
All I'm going to say on that is that I think we're all waiting to sort of see what happens. You know, what we're going to do, though, is we're going to continue to do what we've been doing every day. That is not going to change. We're going to come to work. We are going to put our heads down. We are going to make our focus the patients and trying to get to a place of yes every time we can get to a place of yes. And that doesn't change regardless of any administration.
Say that support for rare and genetic diseases has always been a very strong bipartisan issue and really very well supported by the Republican Party in the past, if that's any hopeful note.
And I'll put it back on our community. You referred to the funding bill, which was quashed last night. That had something called the Pediatric Priority Review Voucher. It's a huge incentive for companies to go into rare disease. It is vital. It is absolutely vital. I will say we will see less approvals without it. And what is really important is for all of this community to engage in advocacy with your senators, with your representatives. Learn about the issues that are critical. Go to the Every Life Foundation and look at their legislative priorities. Listen to their monthly webinars for the rare disease legislative action committees and get engaged with the MPS advocacy organization committee and get out, write letters. People don't write letters anymore. They send emails and they make phone calls. Legislators, listen to you. The government does not belong to this administration. The government belongs to all of us. And as Patty demonstrated, rare disease is a bipartisan program. We have a rare disease legislative caucus 2 senators, a Republican and a Democrat, 2 House members, a Republican and a Democrat. If your representative and your senator are not members, get them on board. You are in charge. Take control. Other questions? Yes, over here. Thank you.
Hi, I just have a quick question. So if a drug has shown efficacy and it might have already gone through a clinical trial in another country and possibly even approved in another country and showed great results and, you know, it's working well for those patients, why might the US still require it to go through, let's say, a global phase 3 here and not give patients who clearly could benefit from the same drug, that drug over here in the US?
So I think one fundamental issue there is that it would take some company, an applicant we call them, to submit a request to us to have us approve that drug. I think that I personally, when we're not right, I personally think that an approval in another country should speak volumes. And you know, another program we're working on in our center in Seaber is something called the Cogent program, which is trying to work towards harmonizing development and approvals of gene and cell therapy products. It's gene right now, it will be cell therapy, I'm sure. There can be specific scenarios where, you know, there could be different issues, I will say. If a drug is really shown demonstrated efficacy outside of the US, we take that information, we take that data. We have...
I think there are 2 examples where that's absolutely happened, where alpha-mannosidosis enzyme replacement therapy and Limeldi, which is the gene therapy for MLD, they were able, after European approvals, with appropriate filings and some other paperwork, to get approved without further clinical trials. And Peter Marks is a huge advocate, among other leadership at FDA, to look at harmonizing, not just with the European Union, with Britain, with Japan, with Australia. So there are efforts out there to streamline that. And sometimes the Europeans are more advanced, sometimes it's us. So it's a 2-way street. But I'm also mindful that I think we need to make room for the next talk.
Oh, sorry.
But Rachel will be here until this evening. She has to leave. Unfortunately, she won't be here tomorrow. Patty is available. I hope you all engage them with questions. Make them feel welcome. Let them know about your story.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.